All right. And welcome back, you guys, to the Self-Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Cory Hagman. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you for tuning in. As always, big shout out to those of you who have rated, reviewed, liked the show. Those of you who are on the notification gang, who are tuning into these episodes as soon as they drop live. Thank you. I am astonished with the podcast growth the last year. It's incredible. And I mean, like, it honestly is faster and at a rate that I never could have expected when I first started doing this. So thank you. It is only possible because of you guys. And yeah, I just going into this new year feeling a lot of gratitude towards the attention that you guys give me. So hopefully continue. Hopefully I am going to strive to continue bringing you guys valuable content and hopefully some actionables. So today we are talking about something that I haven't gone into. First time here, but it is going to be a deep dive into hunger and satiety. And this is something I think Jordan and I, we were talking about on the way home, and he asked me, he's like, do you think some people are just predisposed to be hungrier? Like genetically, do you think that's something that is just you're dealt and you got to deal with those cards? And we started getting into it. I was giving him my thoughts and just like walking him through because he's familiar with ghrelin and leptin. I mean, like his understanding is pretty advanced. But I was just like using some of the practical application that I have, like working with clients, specifically clients who go through like bouts of starvation diets. And I was like, well, here are reasons that I think would be contributing factors, but here's also how the psychology goes into it. And he's like, oh, you should for sure record an episode on this if you haven't already. And yeah, thanks, babe. Thanks for encouraging that. So that's what we're doing today. A deep dive into hunger and satiety, and hopefully you have some actionable takeaways from here. So I want you to think about your body kind of like a house, and the hunger regulation, that is going to be considered your thermostat. This ultimately is what maintains the right temperature, so your energy balance. And I mean, this is, of course, with a heavy asterisk, like ultimately you can be very dysregulated in terms of hunger signaling. And if you don't put food in your mouth, like you won't gain weight. Vice versa, you can be very muted, very low degree of ghrelin and high degree of leptin, which I'll explain how those play a role into this soon. You can have very low hunger signaling, and the fact is you can still gain weight because you were eating enough to put yourself into a surplus. But these two key hormones, ghrelin and leptin, they are going to act like the sensors that are constantly monitoring and adjusting to keep you comfortable. You have to remember that your body at all times, it is trying to keep you safe. It is trying to keep you in a state where there are no threats, including intrinsic stress and intrinsic threats, which would be starvation. So ghrelin, this is like a sensor that detects when the temperature, the energy levels are too low. So it tells your brain it's cold. Turn up the heat. In other words, we need to get food. So leptin is the sensor that detects when the temperature is too high. So it signals essentially we're warm enough, turn the heat off, we've got enough energy, or in this case, food, you can stop eating. Now together, this is what allows you to maintain this energy climate. And in healthy individuals, these regulations should be pretty balanced, ensuring that you neither overheat or overeat or freeze, which in this case would be starve. Now, why does the thermostat malfunction? Like any faulty thermostat, external factors can disrupt this system. Now, the big ones are going to be dieting and fasting. Dieting or fasting, they can lower the temperature, causing ghrelin to kick into overdrive and scream for food. Now, at the same time, leptin, which should calm things down, begins to whisper or lose that sensitivity, kind of like a sensor ignoring warmth. It makes it harder to feel satisfied. Now, other influences would be stress, poor sleep, or unbalanced meals. It can then confuse the thermostat, leaving you feeling hungry even when you've had enough or never quite satisfied with no matter how much you eat. Also the case, I'm going to throw this in there, dehydration. Dehydration is very skewing. That can skew hunger signaling heavily. We're going to get into that today. Now, if we circle back to ghrelin, this is the hunger hormone. It's your body's appetite starter. It's produced in the stomach and small intestine, and it works by binding to specific receptors in the hypothalamus, the brain's hunger control center. Now, think of it as the hormone that flips the hungry switch on or off in your brain. So what increases ghrelin? We've got easy ones: fasting, skipping meals, low calorie diets, because now your body is trying to compensate for this perceived energy deficit, as well as circadian rhythms. So circadian rhythms, your sleep wake cycle, this can also heavily influence ghrelin levels because these levels naturally rise before meals. Now, what decreases ghrelin? Eating especially meals rich in carbohydrates. This temporarily suppresses ghrelin. Now, high body fat stores reduce ghrelin as part of a negative feedback mechanism. But really, when we look at the hormone that is largely going to be tied to the production of body fat and the amount of body fat readily available, that's actually going to be leptin. So leptin is like the brake pedal for appetite. It's produced by fat cells and tells your body when your energy stores are sufficient. Now, this is especially problematic for the physique competitor, especially if you already have dysregulated hunger signaling, because in the state of contest prep, you could at some times be losing 12, 15, 20% of your total body mass. And in this case, like, you're probably losing mostly fat. So where do you think that leptin is going to come from? Well, there's systematically less body fat that can then produce leptin, meaning that you're not going to be getting that tap, that cueing, that physiological cueing to signal that you are satiated. Now, increased leptin, so increased satiation, increased fat mass is the easiest one. Leptin production is proportional to the amount of fat stored in your body, as well as carbohydrate and insulin stimulation. So insulin actually promotes leptin secretion after meals. Now, when we look at the things that decrease leptin, this is going to be simple: weight loss, fat loss, like significant bouts of either of these, fasting, so even acute fasting, and prolonged caloric restriction. These can all lower leptin levels, making it harder to sustain that deficit over time, because now you're not getting that nudge, even though you may have eaten a specific amount of food. And in other words, like at a higher body fat, it would be very satiating and you would feel satisfied. But the leaner you get and the longer that you spend in a deficit, the harder it's going to be for you to continue to get that same signal. So there's a landmark study by Rosenbaum in the 90s showing that after weight loss, leptin levels dropped significantly, like up to 50%, even when body fat decreased modestly. Now, this drop was correlated with increased hunger, so increased ghrelin, reduced energy expenditure, and a greater drive to eat. Now, this is why I'm someone who's like, if you're going to be in a fat loss phase, we need to make sure you are actually losing fat. Like, I don't want to do this passive kind of modality where we just dip our toe into fat loss and just assume that it's coming off, because ultimately you are perceiving that you're in a fat loss phase, and that dietary fatigue is going to accrue even if you're losing very slowly. This becomes problematic when you're not actually losing fat at an adequate rate. And if your goal is to lose 10, 15 pounds, yet it's taking you 6, 8, 9 months to do so, this is ultimately going to come with some kind of reverb on the way out of that diet that ultimately we would rather avoid. Now, let's look closer at dietary composition. So why is it that carbs suppress ghrelin more effectively than fats? Well, carbohydrates stimulate insulin, which enhances post-meal ghrelin suppression. So it suppresses that hunger. Fat, in contrast, has a weaker impact on insulin and doesn't trigger the same response. Protein does suppress ghrelin more effectively and for a longer duration because it's harder to digest, meaning it actually slows down digestion, which can be a nice little hack if you're someone who does find that ghrelin is something that is elevated higher past the point than what you can adequately consume while in a fat loss phase. Now, why does leptin respond to carbs? Now, insulin and leptin are closely connected. When you eat carbs, insulin spikes. This signals to fat cells to secrete leptin, which then communicates satiety. Now, fat alone, consuming fats, doesn't produce this robust insulin-leptin feedback loop. You also have to consider how like the perception of eating fats are 9 calories per gram, whereas carbs and protein are 4 calories per gram. This was something that for the longest time, and just from a budgetary standpoint, like calorically, fiscally responsible, I'm like, I can't get as much fat, like as much volume. And if I know that I want to eat a higher volume meal, it's going to be harder for me to justify eating fats because that's going to inadvertently reduce the amount that I'm going to eat. Now, when we look at the systematic pattern of these rises in ghrelin, why is it that ghrelin levels rise before a meal? So your body actually learns these patterns. And if you consistently eat at noon, ghrelin starts to rise shortly before that, preparing your body for food intake. Now, this is a conditioned response, very similar to Pavlov's dog salivating at the sound of a bell. Now, in the case that you're skipping meals, this conditioning doesn't just modify according to your schedule change. Skipping meals also disrupts this learned ghrelin cycle. So this is going to in turn cause erratic spikes that can then lead to overconsuming later, which is why I'd always say if you have the ability to have a very small snack with you, even if it's an apple, a protein shake, a yogurt, this can put some of that spike at bay or at least reduce it to some extent. So the hypothalamus is the command center for hunger regulation. Now, ghrelin activates varying neurons that then ramp up this hunger signaling. Leptin in turn counters this by activating different neurons, promoting satiety. This very much operates in like a seesaw type fashion where ghrelin tips it towards eating while leptin balances it back to satiety. Now, beyond hunger, ghrelin enhances gastric motility, which really just refers to the contractions of the stomach and the intestines that move food through the digestive system. Now, this ensures that when food enters the stomach, it is efficiently broken down and passed along for nutrient absorption. Now, efficient gastric motility prevents issues like bloating, constipation, and discomfort, nutrient malabsorption. Ghrelin is primarily responsible for acting as that preparatory signal, priming the digestive system for intake and the processing of food. Now, we do see dysregulations of ghrelin and gastric motility linked to conditions like gastroparesis, so delayed stomach emptying, which is the mechanism of action for GLP-1s, as well as functional dyspepsia. Now, ghrelin also stimulates the secretion of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. Now, this is crucial for enhancing lipolysis, supporting muscle building, promoting protein synthesis, as well as regenerating tissues and repairing damage, especially during fasting or caloric restriction. Now, the interplay between these two hormones provides a survival advantage. During periods of fasting, elevated ghrelin drives GH secretion to mobilize that stored energy, so fat breakdown, in order to preserve muscle mass. Now, studies do show that ghrelin administration increases growth hormone levels in humans, highlighting its role as a potent regulator of GH secretion. Now let's turn it back to leptin and insulin sensitivity. Leptin improves this function, the ability for your body to manage glucose by improving insulin sensitivity through glucose uptake into the muscles and liver, reducing hepatic glucose production. Now, past satiety, leptin is pretty fascinating. It improves insulin sensitivity by enhancing glucose uptake into the muscles and reducing hepatic glucose production. This improved insulin sensitivity ensures glucose is efficiently used for energy and then stored as glycogen, reducing that risk of hyperglycemia and subsequently insulin resistance. Now, the thing is, in leptin resistance, which is something that we see very commonly in obese patients, these benefits are diminished. This can inadvertently lead to insulin resistance, which is a hallmark of type 2 diabetes. Now, leptin is actually really solid in promoting fat oxidation. It stimulates lipolysis, it activates AMPK, and other pathways that enhance fatty acid oxidation. This matters because in our case, we are understanding these hormones better and hopefully modulating them in ways that allow us to get more out of our fat loss phases, or at the very least in our off seasons, utilizing hunger signaling and understanding it in a way that allows us to reduce unwanted fat gain or unnecessary fat gain. Now, leptin actually has dual roles in inflammatory processes. In normal levels, it supports the immune system by activating T cells and promoting cytokine production. Now, in excess, which is what we're seeing in obese populations, leptin contributes to low-grade inflammation by stimulating pro-inflammatory inflammatory cytokines. So on one end of the spectrum, with the population that's anorexic, underfed, prolonged caloric restriction, we see that these reduced leptin levels result in a lower degree of fat oxidation, muscle wasting, and energy conservation, making recovery from these states very challenging. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, when we look at the obese population and leptin resistance, these high leptin levels fail to trigger satiety due to resistance impairing insulin sensitivity, promoting further fat accumulation. And this is really why we have to understand these roles. For ghrelin, its role in digestive efficiency and growth hormone secretion highlight its importance beyond appetite, especially during periods of caloric restriction and illness. And if we can further target these pathways, this could aid in conditions, and more in the clinical sense, this is like cachexia and delayed gastric emptying. But in the very one-dimensional niche setting of the sport of bodybuilding or some kind of physique modification, we can see how understanding its role and being able to manipulate it can have benefits to the outcomes that we're desiring. Now, when we look at leptin, its influence on sensitivity and fat metabolism positions it as a central player in metabolic health, particularly for those who are of higher BMI, so obese populations, as well as those who are type 2 diabetic and those who suffer from inflammatory disease processes. So what do we need to know about micronutrient intake and the role that these microbes have on ghrelin and leptin? So we look at vitamin D, for example. Vitamin D enhances leptin sensitivity. Zinc, it's going to boost leptin production. Magnesium, it's going to improve insulin function, indirectly supporting leptin. Omega-3s, this is going to reduce inflammation, improving leptin signaling. And dietary fiber, this is going to slow digestion, reducing that post-meal ghrelin. So really, what's the takeaway here related to micronutrient intake? We shouldn't be allowing micronutrient deficiencies to further exacerbate expected and predictable dysregulation of these hormone signals. So there are chronic states and predispositions that you can find yourself in that essentially are going to make these hunger signals become further and further dysregulated. So in obese populations, we do see that leptin levels are high, the brain stops responding. This is typically what results in leptin resistance. And it's kind of like having a loud alarm clock that just doesn't wake you up, like you have alarm fatigue. At the same time, ghrelin suppression after meals becomes blunted, perpetuating that overeating cycle. Now, in the condition where someone is underweight or underfed, this is where those levels of ghrelin will become extremely elevated and are going to signal to the body that there is a critical need for more food. Now, in turn, as those levels are rising, we're going to see a reduction in leptin, and this is reflected because there are depleted fat stores, making it harder to feel full. This is where I think a lot of people, specifically in the sport of bodybuilding, they find themselves the tail end of contest prep, and even if food is technically higher, just on account of how dysregulated these two hormones are, they find themselves oftentimes insatiable. But what about in the case where you just start a diet? You just get into it and you're already feeling these shifts in ghrelin starting to rise, leptin starting to drop. What could be potentiating that? Now, these are two that I harp on all the time, and that's stress management and sleep management. Stress raises ghrelin, triggering comfort eating. Sleep deprivation skews ghrelin leptin ratio, amplifying hunger and reducing that satiety. You have to understand that stress and sleep deprivation, these are two things that the body cues up as threats. It's going to modify varying feedback loops in order to get you to seek out some additional resource, whether that be fuel or recovery in the form of sleep. Now, I want to go back to leptin resistance, because this is something I know a lot of you are probably keyed up on, like, yo, this sounds like me. It doesn't have a universally defined threshold, but there are several key factors that influence its development. Biggest one being total body fat mass. So leptin production is proportional to fat mass. And in obese individuals, those who often have leptin levels 4 to 5 times higher than those of normal weight individuals, they experience an overwhelm of that signaling along the pathways leading to this resistance. Now, studies do suggest that resistance becomes more evident in individuals with a body fat percentage of 32% or higher in women and 25% or higher in men, although this isn't an absolute cutoff. So the other thing you have to understand is the duration. So prolonged exposure to these high leptin levels, that ultimately is what contributes to the receptor desensitization and downstream signaling disruptions. So if you are experiencing that chronic low-grade inflammation associated with long-term obesity, this can further impair leptin sensitivity, particularly through cytokine interference. So what about weight gain? This is a super popular topic within the sport of physique modification. And there often is that argument, well, am I doing any damage to my hunger signaling by regaining a ton of weight post-show or post-fat loss phase? And what we do see is that rapid and significant weight gain, about 20 to 30% above baseline weight, does exacerbate leptin resistance more acutely than gradual weight gain, likely due to sudden metabolic stress and inflammatory responses. This is why I do think we have to be mindful of the positions that we're putting ourselves in relative to how lean we are going to get for a contest. If you're someone who does struggle, and trust me, I've been there myself, we're coming out of prep, things are very rocky. And over the course of the next 4 to 5 months, that weight is coming on faster than I'd like. This is why being very methodical about the approach to fat loss and taking as few extremes as you can help taking can ultimately position you so that after the show, you are not at a higher risk of regaining that weight at a rapid rate. So what about reversibility? Leptin resistance is generally reversible with significant fat loss. This is specific to the obese population, but reduction in adipose tissue decreases leptin levels, restoring that sensitivity. However, this recovery can be pretty slow as inflammation and receptor desensitization can persist even after weight loss. So we do see a study showing that leptin sensitivity could improve with weight loss, but additional lifestyle interventions were critical for fully restoring that sensitivity. Now, really where we see issues are in the cases of long-term severe obesity. So over 10 years, leptin resistance may become more challenging to reverse due to that prolonged inflammation and structural changes in the hypothalamic neurons. Now, when we look at what promotes recovery, what causes that re-regulation, and of course, this is specific to obese populations, but I think there is inference that we can gather from this and we can apply then for those of us who are going to go through those bouts of extreme weight loss and then some degree of weight gain that's going to happen relatively faster than we'd like. So gradual and sustained weight loss of 5 to 10% body weight does improve leptin sensitivity more effectively than rapid weight loss. Also, having an anti-inflammatory diet rich in omega-3s and antioxidants, this can reduce inflammation and support recovery. And the big one here, exercising. This will directly improve that sensitivity by reducing inflammation, enhancing hypothalamic signaling pathways. Now, you can probably extrapolate the things that are going to make it worse, but we'll go through them. Weight regain after dieting, so yo-yo dieting. This worsens leptin resistance by creating a cycle of fluctuation. Chronic stress and poor sleep interfere with recovery by increasing ghrelin levels and promoting inflammation. So you'll see this is very interconnected and related to the state that we're likely going to put ourselves in if we're going through an extreme weight loss phase, i.e. contest prep. So this is where we can also, on the other side of things, we can extrapolate some of the literature relative to those underweight and anorexic because there is a hefty crossover to physique sports. And when you look at ghrelin and leptin dysregulation, ghrelin is elevated in those that's underweight due to low caloric intake and energy stores. And even though it continues to elevate because it's acting as a compensatory signal to increase hunger, this elevation is not effective in stimulating normal eating behavior due to psychological factors, or in the case due to contest prep, just the fact that you need to follow your program in order to continue to see that sustained weight loss. Now, we also see in those that are underweight and anorexic, leptin is severely reduced due to depleted fat stores. Now, low leptin levels signal energy insufficiency, which ultimately delays satiety. It contributes to energy conservations, which we consider that leptin levels below 1 to 2 nanograms per milliliter, that is indicative of severe energy deficiency, whereas normal levels range from 5 to 15 nanograms per milliliter in healthy individuals. Now, what is the turnaround time for normalization? Again, this is what we can extrapolate for that post-diet period. So when we look at ghrelin recovery, mitigating those exacerbated levels, ghrelin levels decrease relatively quickly with refeeding for about 1 to 2 weeks as caloric intake increases. But this is particularly when meals are frequent and nutrient dense. This is one of the reasons that I would say after you get off stage, after you end a fat loss phase, the most important thing to do is to have that routine and have those set meals planned. If you are going to go out to eat, yes, in a perfect world, it would be great if you could save some of that food for that later meal. But realistically, there is a tipping point where you are now fasting, which is only going to exacerbate those already elevated ghrelin levels, making it that much harder to regulate food consumption later in the day. Now, this is the part I find really interesting. Leptin recovery, it does seem to be slower because they depend on fat mass restoration. So significant increases in leptin typically require regaining at least 5 to 10% of weight, reaching a healthy body fat percentage. So we do have literature to show that leptin levels in anorexic patients increase significantly within 4 to 6 weeks of refeeding, but still remained low because body fat was on technically the lower side. When we start looking at stress and sleep deprivation, stress-induced dysregulation, stress increases ghrelin secretion, promoting that desire to comfort eat. This acts on the brain's reward system, reinforcing the consumption of these calorie-dense foods as a coping mechanism. And if you've ever struggled with that, I can tell you personally that's something that is a very hard cycle to break. And if you can, I would aim to just avoid developing that cycle to begin with. Now, what's interesting is that stress is going to decrease leptin sensitivity even if those levels remain high, which is going to diminish satiety signals. So overarching, if you're looking at prolonged stress and its contribution to low-grade inflammation, this is going to only further impair leptin sensitivity and it's going to increase ghrelin production, which is why a big theme for me lately has been explaining how we need to go about managing stress in whatever form and fashion it's presenting itself. The stress management techniques, I know it's cool, it's in vogue to be like, hey, I just deal with so much stress, I just disassociate it, I push it to the back of my mind. Okay, you're not that cool. Like, just be an adult, manage your stress, do what you can to create an environment that is at the very least tolerable, because a certain amount of stress is good for you, but it's very clear when you look at different comorbidities and different health markers, the negative impact that sustained chronic levels of stress can have on different systems. Now, for those of you who are really insistent, like I don't need a ton of sleep, like I can just get by on the least. A lack of sleep elevates ghrelin by 15 to 20%, and it increases hunger and cravings for high calorie foods. Sleep deprivation does reduce leptin levels by about 20% as well, impairing satiety signals. Now, this effect occurs even after a single night of poor sleep. And we do have literature to show that individuals sleeping 4 hours per night had a 28% increase in ghrelin and an 18% reduction in leptin compared to those sleeping 8 hours a night, highlighting the profound impact of sleep on hunger signaling. Now, exercise has profound effects on hunger regulation, influencing both ghrelin and leptin. And these effects vary based on the type, intensity, and duration. So when we look at resistance training, so this is weightlifting, bodyweight training, resistance bands, focusing on building muscle strength, hypertrophy. When you look at the acute effects on ghrelin levels are typically suppressed immediately after resistance training, leading to reduced hunger. Now, this is thought to be because there's a redistribution of blood flow away from the gut, so reducing ghrelin secretion. There's also been shown to be increased lactate production, which may inhibit ghrelin release, and also a temporary elevation in catecholamine, so adrenaline, which suppresses appetite. Now, how long does this last? The suppression of ghrelin can last anywhere from 1 to 2 hours post-exercise, depending on the intensity and the volume of the workout. Now, we do have a study that found that ghrelin levels were reduced about 15% immediately after high-intensity resistance training, correlating with decreased hunger perception. Over time, regular resistance training can contribute to improved ghrelin regulation by enhancing metabolic health, insulin sensitivity, body composition. Now, this is nothing new, and I think a lot of you guys are probably already doing some kind of training program, but if you're on the outer skirts and you're like, I don't really like resistance training, well, I would revisit those benefits and really consider whether or not there's application for you, at least from a hunger regulation standpoint. Now, when we look at leptin, there aren't many immediate effects on leptin levels after training because leptin primarily responds to energy stores in long-term caloric balance rather than acute activity. However, resistance training does increase muscle mass, which can indirectly influence leptin sensitivity by improving insulin function. So when we look at long-term resistance training, this reduces fat mass, a major driver of leptin secretion, potentially lowering circulating leptin. So we need to understand the role that body composition plays here. But this decrease can restore leptin sensitivity, particularly in individuals with obesity or leptin resistance. Now, we do have a study that shows that regular resistance training reduced leptin levels by about 25% in overweight adults after 12 weeks, correlating with improved fat loss and metabolic markers. So what about cardiovascular exercise? So anything involving running, swimming, cycling, brisk walking, focusing on endurance and cardiovascular fitness. So for ghrelin, moderate intensity exercise, ghrelin is typically suppressed during it and immediately after moderate exercise, so jogging, cycling at 60 to 70% max heart rate, whereas with high intensity exercise, with intervals or long duration endurance exercises, there tends to be a stronger suppressive effect on ghrelin. This mechanism is thought to be because of the redistribution of blood flow away from the GI tract, as well as the increased release of appetite-suppressing hormones like YY peptide, glucagon-like peptide during exercise. Now, stress hormone release also during exercise may temporarily suppress ghrelin. Now, this suppression is typically 1 to 3 hours post-exercise and considered transient, but we do have a study showing that ghrelin levels went down by about 30% after 60 minutes of moderate intensity running with corresponding decrease in hunger. As I discussed with weight training, the same kind of applies to leptin in the acute phases relative to cardiovascular exercise. Leptins don't really significantly change immediately after cardio. There are temporary reductions in circulating leptin that may be due to exercise-induced energy expenditure, but these are modest and considered short-lived. So when we look at the dietary strategies for managing hunger signaling, something I'm a big fan of is referencing the Satiety Index. Now, this index was developed through research, and essentially it ranks food based on their ability to produce satiety or feeling of fullness after eating. And by selecting foods that rank higher on the index, individuals can better manage their appetite, reduce calorie intake, and optimize hormonal regulation of both ghrelin and leptin. So this study was introduced by Susanna Holt in 95 through measuring various foods and how they influenced hunger levels over a 2-hour period of consumption. So each food was assigned a satiety score compared to white bread, which was given a baseline value of 100. So foods scoring higher than 100 are more satiating. They keep you fuller for longer. Foods scoring lower than 100 are less satiating and may lead to increased hunger soon after eating. So if we look at the key factors influencing satiety, we see protein content, fiber content, energy density, and glycemic response alongside water content were primary contributing factors that aided in higher scores assigned to each food. Now, why is this? Well, with protein content, protein is the most satiating macronutrient. Protein reduces ghrelin significantly and increases PYY and GLP. These are both satiety hormones. Now, with fiber content, high fiber foods slow down digestion, reducing ghrelin release and prolonging fullness. Now, in terms of energy density, foods with lower energy density, lower calories per gram, provide bulk without excess calories. So volume, this enhances satiety. We also have to look at the glycemic response. Foods with a low glycemic response, slow releasing carbs, maintain steady blood sugar levels and satiety levels. Now, we also got to look at water content. High water foods, fruits, vegetables, potatoes, which rank obnoxiously high on this index, add volume to meals and enhance fullness without adding calories. So a few examples of high scoring foods. We've got boiled potatoes scoring 323, oatmeal scoring a little over 200, oranges scoring 200, apples 197, fish 225. I think it's specific to ling also, which is a white fish, very delicious. Eggs are 150, beans and lentils 168, lean meats 145, whole grain bread 157, and white bread 100. Now, for a different reference point, you can see croissants, yogurt, those are much lower on the satiety index, meaning they don't create that same feeling and perception of satiation after consuming. So what can we really learn from this? Foods high in protein and fiber suppress ghrelin production because they take longer to digest. So these high protein foods delay gastric emptying, reducing the need for ghrelin release. Fibrous foods slow the rate of digestion, keeping these levels low for extended periods of time. Now, fibrous foods slow the rate of digestion, keeping ghrelin levels low for an extended period of time. So when you look at leptin sensitivity, you're seeing high volume, low energy density, so low calorie foods, nutrient rich foods, so vegetables, legumes, fruits, they improve leptin sensitivity by reducing inflammation associated with leptin resistance. These diets rich in omega-3 fatty acids, fish, antioxidants enhance leptin signaling by modulating these inflammatory pathways. So, what are the takeaways? For me, I think that anyone struggling with adherence should do a little bit of an audit of your current meal plan, of your intake. And for instance, like rice is prescribed on almost every meal plan. And it drives me nuts because I'm like, yo, like when I'm dieting, like if I'm eating like 1,500 calories, if I'm told to eat rice 3 times a day, I'm only gonna get like 50 grams of uncooked rice. It's going to be a very small amount. And that's kind of obnoxious when you're like, hey, I want to feel like I'm not killing myself or starving myself. I want to feel like my meals are still somewhat enjoyable and satiating. I think we have to look at meal composition as well as food selection and really determine, like, is this the best use of the calories that we have at hand? Could we potentially swap these out for higher satiety foods that ultimately would allow us to have a higher perception of fullness and also modulate some of these hunger signalings? I hope this was helpful. I hope you enjoyed it. It is time for me to eat now. So break time. As always, I will see you in the next one.